Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to call the meeting of the Standing Committee on Legislative Offices to order and welcome everyone in attendance. My name is Brad Rutherford, MLA for Leduc-Beaumont and Chair of the committee, and I'd ask that members and those joining us at the committee or at the table introduce themselves for the record, and then I will call on those joining us remotely, and I'll begin to my right.
MLA Nicholas Milliken, Calgary Currie.
MLA Martin Long, West Yellowhead.
MLA Amory, Calgary Cross.
MLA Heather Sweet, Edmonton Manning.
Good afternoon, Raki Pancholi, MLA for Edmonton Whitemud.
Good afternoon, Philip Masseline, Clerk Assistant Director of House Services.
Good afternoon, Terry Churkwich, Law Clerk.
Good afternoon, Jody Rempel, Committee Clerk.
Thank you. And going online, we'll start with Mr. Van Dyken.
MLA Glenn Van Dyken, Athabasca Barhead, West Lock.
Thank you. Ms. Allard.
MLA Tracy Lard, Grand Prairie.
Mr. Ceci.
Joe Ceci, Calgary, Buffalo.
And Ms. Rosen.
Miranda Rosen, MLA for Banff Kananaskis.
Thank you. And just to note a few substitutions, Ms. Pancholi for Member Loyola, Mr. Amory for Mr. Smith. And a few housekeeping items to address before we turn to the business at hand. Pursuant to the direction of the Honourable Speaker Cooper, I would remind everyone of the updated committee room protocols which require that outside of the individuals with an exemption, those attending a committee meeting in person must wear a mask at all times unless they are speaking. In addition, attendees are reminded to leave an appropriate distance between themselves and other meeting participants. Please note that the microphones are operated by Hansard, so during the meeting, members do not need to operate them. Committee proceedings are being live streamed on the internet and broadcast on Alberta Assembly TV, and please set your cell phones and other devices to silent for the duration of the meeting. And we just have one guest who has joined us. Sorry, do we need to have her introduce herself?
Yes.
If Ms. Zahir, could you introduce yourself, please? Okay, we will work on that. The draft agenda was distributed to all committee members. Does anyone have an issue or want to raise any changes to propose? If not, could I get a motion to approve today's meeting agenda? Thank you, Mr. Milliken, who has moved that the January 11th, 2022 meeting agenda of the Standing Committee on Legislative Offices be approved as circulated. All those in favor in the room, please say aye. Anyone in the room opposed, please say no. And moving online, all those in favor online, please say aye.
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 And anyone online opposed, please say no. Thank you. That motion has been carried. Did I just hear someone? No, maybe not. Adoption of the meeting minutes. Are there any errors or omissions to note? And if not, would a member move to approve the minutes as distributed? Mr. Long has moved that the minutes of the December 3rd, 2021 meeting of the Standing Committee on Legislative Offices be approved as distributed. All those in favor in the room, please say aye. Aye. Anyone in the room who is opposed, please say no. And moving online, all those in favor online, please say aye.
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 And anyone online who is opposed, please say no. Thank you. That motion has been carried. Moving on to item agenda 4, review of the Office of the Child and Youth Advocate Annual Report 2020-21. So the mandate of Government Motion 105. We have the review of the Office of the Child and Youth Advocate Annual Report 2020-21. Our mandate for the review of this report is outlined in Government Motion 105, which was agreed to on November 24th and requires us to report back to the Assembly by February 22nd, 2022. This is the third time that the committee has been tasked with this annual responsibility. Does anybody have any questions as to Government Motion 105 that we can answer before we proceed moving forward? Okay, hearing none, I will always give a bit of an awkward pause there just so anybody online can ask if you're wondering why I'm waiting just that extra few seconds. So hearing none, we can move on to item B, presentation from the Child and Youth Advocate. Mr. Delgraff and his colleagues have joined us today and are prepared to provide us with a briefing of about 30 minutes on their annual report. And then I will open up the floor to questions from committee members. Mr. Graff, when you are ready, please proceed with your presentation, sir.
Good afternoon, Chairperson Rutherford and committee members. I don't see the PowerPoint slides up. I wonder if Jody could put someone could put the second slide 2 up for us, please.
But we are just going to work on that, hopefully, and you should be seeing it now. Okay.
We don't see it.
We'll just give that a moment to try to correct it.
Okay. There we are.
Okay, please proceed. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, Chairperson Rutherford and committee members. It's nice to see all of you again, even though we're virtually connected. With me today is Terry Pelton, our Executive Director of Child and Youth Advocacy. Mr. Chair, our work extends throughout the province. We respectfully acknowledge that Alberta is the traditional and ancestral territory of many Indigenous peoples of Treaties 6, 7, and 8, the Métis settlements, and the 6 regions of the Métis Nation of Alberta. It's important to acknowledge the territory we are in and to remind us all of the disproportionate number of Indigenous young people who are in the child intervention and youth justice systems. Next slide, please. Today, we will provide an overview of our 2020-2021 annual report. This review expands on our December 3rd presentation to the Standing Committee on Legislative Offices and addresses 4 areas: advocacy in changing times, highlights of the past year, reporting to Albertans, and looking ahead. I'll now turn it over to Terry. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Del. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and committee members. When young people contact our office, they're looking for support with issues that matter deeply to them. They may feel their voices aren't being heard by adults or that their viewpoints aren't considered when decisions are made about them. The advocacy work of our office is multifaceted and involves helping young people learn about their rights, navigate complex systems, and have their interests represented in legal processes. This was a challenging year for the young people we serve. The pandemic intensified many of the issues and concerns they faced and required us to pivot our advocacy efforts. Our staff had to adjust quickly to work remotely and embrace new technology so we could continue to provide quality advocacy services safely and effectively, even when we couldn't be together physically. While relationship building is best done face-to-face, our staff worked tirelessly to build and nurture relationships with young people virtually. The 3 main issues we assisted young people with were placement, maintaining connections, and case planning. Next slide, please. Despite the challenges presented by the pandemic, we continued to stand up for young people and to elevate their rights and interests to decision makers. We even found new ways to support them and to connect with young people and those who support them. Our annual efforts around National Child Day were reimagined. We worked with community partners to create new virtual events, promotional videos, and engaging social media and blog content to celebrate and promote children's rights. One of our most popular in-person learning activities is our Advocacy 101 workshop. The training helps stakeholders learn about our office, the rights of young people, and how to advocate on their behalf and support them. During the early months of the pandemic, we shifted to a virtual method of delivery, and were pleasantly surprised by the positive response. Due to high demand, we more than doubled the number of Advocacy 101 workshops and now have a wait list. Consider these numbers. From April 1st, 2020 to March 31st, 2021, we received almost 4,100 intakes with just over 2,700 young people receiving advocacy services. over 3,200 young people were appointed lawyers for child intervention matters. The circumstances of 132 young people who'd been seriously injured or passed away were reviewed. And our actual spending in both operating and capital expenditure categories was $13.9 million, which was 6% below the approved amounts. We also worked on a statement of concern related to high conflict custody disputes, revitalizing our youth council, and facilitating increased meetings through a virtual platform. The council met with the Minister of Children's Services about the impacts of lowering the age for support and financial assistance agreements, and finally, completing the preliminary requirements for a new advocacy information system to replace our aging system that we've been working with since 2005. I'll now talk about our public reports to Albertans. Next slide, please. There's a number of ways we report to Albertans. These include our annual report, investigative reviews, special reports, and statements of concern. This committee is already quite familiar with our annual report. It summarizes our major activities over the reporting period and highlights our priorities for the year ahead. Our financial statements and performance measures are included in the annual report, fulfilling the financial reporting responsibility of the Child and Youth Advocate. There's also a legislative requirement for us to present the report to this committee, which is why we're here today. We conduct two types of investigative reviews into the serious injury or death of a young person. Both result in a public report that includes findings, observations, and recommendations. The ministry or child serving agency identified in our recommendations must respond within 75 days. During this reporting period, we released two mandatory review reports, which together examined the circumstances of 23 young people who passed away. We made 6 new recommendations to the Ministry of Children's Services about file transfers and the need for whole family residential treatment, to the Ministry of Community and Social Services about collaborative practice and a review of the Family Support for Children with Disabilities policy, to the Ministry of Justice and Solicitor General about no contact orders, and to the Ministries of Health and Children's Services recommending a forum related to the Provincial Youth Suicide Prevention Strategy. All of our investigative reviews, both systemic and mandatory, focus on engaging with the people who knew the young person best. Elders and community members provide valuable insight by elevating the voices of young people within the context of families and communities. We also have the authority to release a special report if there are systemic issues affecting a number of children and youth. We identify these through a number of sources, but primarily we learn about them through knowledge sharing across our office. We didn't release a special report in 2020-21. However, significant work was done on 2 reports. Renewed focus on youth opioid use was released this past June, and Strengthening Foundations, a systemic investigative review, was released this past September. Finally, in March 2021, we issued our first statement of concern, which is one way we can bring public attention to matters that don't fall within our mandate, but negatively impact young people. We'd observed a concerning trend about the well-being of children whose families are involved in high conflict custody disputes. Over 5 years, we'd received over 1,000 intake calls and been notified of 4 young people who'd passed away while their families were struggling with this issue. We identified conflict as potentially the most harmful factor for children whose parents have separated. It's critical that families receive appropriate and timely supports to resolve their conflicts before they reach a crisis. The Ministry of Justice and Solicitor General has accepted the intent of the statement of concern, and we continue to look forward to hearing what actions they are taking. I'll now turn it over to Del. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Terry. As we look ahead to the upcoming year, there are 4 areas we want to focus on to improve services for young people. Next slide, please. 31 years ago, in his first annual report, the Children's Advocate identified the issue of the disproportionate number of Indigenous young people in the child welfare system. More than a generation later, this overrepresentation is worse now than it was then. The root causes as to why Indigenous young people continue to be overrepresented in our child welfare and youth justice systems must be addressed. It won't be easy. The federal legislation, an act respecting First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children, youth, and families, is a significant step forward. It provides a framework for Indigenous peoples to develop their own child and family services, which is a good thing for children and families. At the OCYA, we have been learning about the legislation and identifying resources to help us understand some of the changes to child intervention. We are continuing to learn and are reaching out to Indigenous leadership to discuss what this could mean for them and for us. We believe in the inherent right of Indigenous peoples to raise their own children. We also believe Indigenous peoples have the right to provide the care, supports, and services their children need. This legislation will affect our future work and relationships with Indigenous communities. It means we will need to shift our strategic priorities to ensure more consistency with the young people we serve, the majority of whom are Indigenous. And if we want the very best outcomes for Indigenous young people, we need to do all we can to support them as they move along this path. Next slide, please. The Child and Youth Advocate Act was last amended in 2018. Over the past several years of working under these legislative changes, we've identified a number of ways our act could be further strengthened to benefit young people, the overall work of our office, and child-serving ministries. Three key areas for consideration are age provisions, strengthening recommendations responses, and additional opportunities and challenges. With respect to age provisions, under our current act, a child is defined as under the age of 18 or under 22 if they have a support and financial assistance agreement. The age provision and definitions of children and youth are not aligned with youth justice or child intervention, which results in times when we cannot advocate for young people receiving designated services. For example, a young person who is over 18 may be serving their sentence at a young offender center, but unable to receive individual advocacy services because of their age. And young adults over 18 cannot have a lawyer appointed for a child intervention matter. Aligning ages to be consistent with related legislation would allow us to address the needs of all young people within our mandate. The second area we'd like to propose a change is related to strengthening responses to our recommendations. Currently, our legislation requires a ministry to publicly respond within 75 days of receipt of a recommendation. It is the only requirement for government related to our recommendations. In 2017, the Ministerial Panel on Child Intervention and the Standing Committee on Legislative Offices called for implementation of practices that would ensure accountability from both the OCYA and government departments. We believe these calls for government accountability require a response much greater than what is currently reflected. Therefore, we're proposing that this annual review process focus on both our office's contributions and recommendations made and on what the relevant ministries have done to address those recommendations. This committee and all Albertans deserve to know what actions are taken and what outcomes are achieved in our collective efforts to improve the circumstances of young people. The third area of proposed change relates to the last amendments to the Child and Youth Advocate Act. At that time, the Ministerial Panel on Child Intervention looked closely at child death review and determined that the OCYA should be the primary body to review deaths of children and young adults involved with children's services. The panel made 7 recommendations, which amended our legislation to include mandatory investigative reviews. It was a positive and significant development for our office and for the province. Concurrently, there was a legislative review of our act being completed by the Standing Committee on Legislative Offices. 66 written submissions and 28 oral submissions were reviewed, and the Standing Committee made 9 resolutions. None were included in the amendments to the Act in 2018. We believe all 9 resolutions are still relevant to our work and are important to our ability to represent the rights, interests, and viewpoints of young people. I will now talk briefly about some challenges with systemic and mandatory reviews. The first is that our Act has 2 different ways to define young people for systemic or mandatory reviews. Systemic reviews are considered for young people receiving a designated service when they're seriously injured or pass away or within 2 years of receiving that service. Mandatory reviews are required for young people identified as a child in need of intervention at the time of their passing or within 2 years. This complicates the review process, and we believe a clear definition of young people for reviews should be considered. In addition, the purpose of mandatory reviews is not defined in our Act. We know from our experience that families and others close to young people frequently ask about our purpose when doing reviews. Given no legislative guidance for mandatory reviews, we identified the purpose of improving the lives of young people by reviewing their circumstances for systemic issues, services and supports, and/or public assurance. We're recommending the purpose of mandatory child death reviews be clearly identified in the Child and Youth Advocate Act. Also, because of the volume of reviews and the requirement that we report to the Speaker every 6 months, we publicly release mandatory reviews twice each year. The Act currently requires that mandatory reviews must be completed and publicly available within 1 year. The timelines for public release is problematic, particularly when considering the grief and loss for families. We're recommending the timelines be extended for public release to within 18 months of notification. And this is distinct from the completion of the review, which could remain within that 12-month period. Lastly, there is no provision for further reviews of the Child and Youth Advocate Act. The Act still refers to the original date of 2016 for review. The Standing Committee identified that the Act should be reviewed every 5 years. We think this is critical, particularly given the nature of the last review and the impact of the ministerial panel on the resolutions brought forward by the Standing Committee. Next slide, please. This past year didn't come without challenges for the young people we serve, nor for our staff. However, we are proud of how we navigated the public health restrictions as we continue to stand up for young people. Moving forward, we must strengthen our focus on ending the overrepresentation of Indigenous young people in the child welfare and youth justice systems, and work towards true reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. As well, I urge you to act on strengthening accountability measures for government when we make recommendations. Finally, I would advocate for a review of the Child and Youth Advocate Act with consideration for the areas that we have raised in this presentation. Chairperson Rutherford and committee members, I've had the privilege to serve as Alberta's Child and Youth Advocate for almost 11 years, and to be the first with the mandate of an independent office of the Legislative Assembly. It has been an incredible experience and the most rewarding and meaningful work of my public service career. We'd now be happy to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Graff, for that presentation. And now we'll turn to committee members. Ms. Pancholi, I see you're flagging me down for the first question. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ms. Pelton and Mr. Graff, for joining us today. Before we begin, I would like to take this opportunity to thank you, Mr. Graff, for your service as the Child and Youth Advocate. I know you have been a tireless champion for the children that you serve, and we have all benefited from your commitment and advocacy, and I think I just would like to express my thanks on behalf of myself and my caucus members, and I'm sure the other committee members as well. I'd like to begin my questions by asking, I do have quite a few, I'm warning the chair of that right now, but I will begin with something referenced both in your presentation as well as in the annual report. You mentioned on page 11 of the annual report that one of the major pieces of work that you undertook in your office in the 2020-21 fiscal year, although the report was not finished until later in 2021, but during that fiscal year you undertook work on the youth opioid use in Alberta. and that led to the follow-up report later that year. So page 18 really sums up the urgency of this issue quite well, and it talks about that since the release of your 2018 report into focus, young people continue to die by opioid poisoning at alarming rates. And your review noted on page 47 of the annual report mentioned the previous recommendations made by your office regarding opioid-related deaths and the urgency of implementing these recommendations. And a number of reviews, of course, have noted substance abuse as being a factor. As we are in the middle of a record year for deaths amongst our most vulnerable youth, what do you see as the risks of failing to act quickly on this youth opioid file?
I don't know how to respond to that other than to say the risks are greater tragedies for young people as a result of opioid use. I am very concerned about it. One of the reasons we did the renewed focus report was because we were concerned about the lack of a comprehensive approach to our earlier report that was released in 2018. And along with that concern of insufficient response, we have had significant additional deaths and tragedies for young people as a result of opioid poisonings. And when we looked at the issue again, and we went to communities and we spoke with many people, we were seeing that we don't hold that concern ourselves. It's a concern that's reflected in every group that we spoke with. Perhaps, Terry, you'd like to expand on that. You were involved in the development of the report, so you can perhaps make a comment.
I don't have much to add other than I think the risk is that we are going to continue to see young people dying, and we want to see that change. And we believe that the comprehensive strategy is what it will take to move it along.
Follow-up?
Yeah, for a follow-up, please go ahead.
Thank you. I appreciate that very much. And I know that your office has called for a youth opioid strategy from the government. Can you indicate what response have you seen from the government in terms of developing that youth opioid strategy? What progress has been made? Has it even been fully accepted? And what would you see as progress? What in your eyes would mean that this government was actually taking action to develop that strategy?
I'll answer the second part first, and we'll try to find some information about the first part of your question. What we'd like to see is a strategy that is across the continuum, similar to the recommendations that we had made in our first report on opioid poisonings for young people, and that strategy being implemented across our province with a full continuum of services that are reflected both at the preventative and at the intervention end of those continuums, and in fact at the harm reduction end. This is a crisis that is so significant that the principles that we try to employ to intervene, I think, are critical, and that means that the life and safety of young people has to be first. It has to be before other considerations, and from my point of view, it's just really an urgent matter, and it's one that's been urgent for some time. I'm also very concerned that while today, we may be talking about fentanyl and carfentanil as being major contributions to these tragedies. There are other drugs that are in play that are not related, that do not have an opioid base, and in fact can be as lethal, if not more lethal. And that's something that we all need to be to not take action sooner is a real problem. And in our refocus, what we're really hoping for is a coordinated, comprehensive approach through a plan.
Thank you. And just before we get to Mr. Amory, Mr. Shepherd, if you'd like to introduce yourself, please, for the record.
Certainly. David Shepherd, MLA, Edmonton City Centre.
Thank you. And one more time, we'll try to get Ms. Ahir to introduce herself, please.
Hello, Bila here, Chestermere Strathmore.
Thank you so much for that. And over to Mr. Amory for a question and a follow-up.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you. I understand that you will not be renewing your contract, and so before I begin, I too want to take this opportunity to thank you for the work that you have done as the child and youth advocate on behalf of my colleagues, and I'm sure all of the committee members as well. I'm looking at your annual report, and I see on page 24 the intake services highlights here. Your annual report says that your office received referrals from 4,092 young people, some of which who have benefited from legal representations for children and youth, which is down 20% from the 2019 to 2020 intakes. Similarly, intakes received by child intervention were down at 27% as well. I'm going to ask both of my questions at once because I think they may be related to one another. Is there any indication that you can provide this committee as to what could be behind these decreases in 2020-2021 as compared to 2019 to 2020? And secondly, in the referrals that you did receive, what sort of information can you provide to this committee about the impact of the pandemic and the complexity of cases and how it impacted the number of intakes that you received this past year? Thank you.
Thank you. Certainly, I will start a response and ask Terry to follow up with some additional information. We noted that there was a reduction as well, and one of the things that is a consideration in those reductions is the number of court matters that are being moved forward, and the number of children who are in care. And we know that both of those were also reduced during that time period, and so it would stand to reason that the request for our services would reduce in those two program areas. That being said, one of the things that the pandemic has brought with it was the need for a significant increase in our ability to respond to calls from young people, from those who care about young people who are struggling with a range of issues. Some of those issues could be related to advocacy services or to the designated services of our office. Some of them were not. And so we would often act as a clearinghouse in terms of making referrals to other community agencies for supports for young people. Terry, did you want to respond with some additional information?
Sure, I can add a little bit of information related to the complexity of the intakes. I think we've seen a significant increase in how complex children and families are responding to the pandemic and the impact that has on them. Historically, we wouldn't have had intakes about whether or not children should be in person in school, or whether or not they can have a visit with family. Children's Services has been quite responsive with keeping children connected, but there's still times when foster families may not be comfortable, or group homes have an outbreak or somebody who's tested positive, and then that impacts young people's ability to connect with others. We really did see an increase in the number of young people just feeling isolated, that the homeschooling maybe was not what worked best for them, but it was really, for some it works really great, and for others it doesn't work great at all. It's been a really hard year, I think, for our intake team because of the breadth and depth of the calls they're getting and the crisis that not just young people are feeling, but we're getting a number of calls from individuals who don't fall within our mandate, and we're doing our very best to connect them with the right service.
The only other thing that I would add to that is that the calls that we received ended up being at a volume where we had to allocate additional resources to be able to manage them. They were a significant number for a good period of time.
Thank you. I understand there's not a follow-up for this. Ms. Pancholi, go ahead.
Thank you. Mr. Graff, I want to follow up a little bit on my last question and as well as something that was raised in your presentation about greater accountability, I think, before this committee, and really this committee acting on behalf of the Assembly and Albertans, really, from government ministries in response to the recommendations that you've made in your report. Specifically, with respect to the youth opioid strategy, you've made that call. You mentioned it came in 2018 and again in your follow-up report last year. And you've very clearly outlined, and I think Albertans recognize the risks, the significant impacts if action is not taken in a coordinated way. But I'd like to ask you a little bit about what do you feel is required for accountability on that recommendation? Have you had any response from the Ministry of Health and Associate Ministry of Health and Addictions, Mental Health and Addictions, around the development of a youth opioid strategy? What accountability should this committee expect from that ministry in response to your recommendation for a youth opioid strategy?
Yeah, I can tell you that we have had some responses to some of the recommendations, and if we thought they were sufficient, we would not have completed a renewed focus report. We didn't believe that they were sufficient. But for example, one of the things that we asked for as a recommendation in our Into Focus report was a review of the drug abuse. The drug use legislation. I'll just find the recommendation right now, and that recommendation, that review of that piece of legislation was completed. It's been was thorough. There's still some action to do, but we noted significant progress in relation to it. We made a recommendation as well that substance use education should be part of the school curriculum on an ongoing basis, and that it should be embedded in the school curriculum so that every young person had an age-appropriate exposure to substance use prevention education. And we've not seen sufficient action in that regard. And each of our recommendations, we have a process where we ask for updates from the ministries, and most often they provide them. And when they do, we assess that information against what we had expected for our recommendation, and then we publicly post it on our website. And so all of those kinds of those responses would be reflected in terms of our assessment regarding the recommendations that we've made. But those are two examples of different ways that we've seen our recommendations responded to. The coordinated strategy, we've not seen a strategy come forward. And for us, that is perhaps the most concerning, because it tells us that the other activities then aren't moving forward in a coordinated fashion.
Thank you. And yeah, as a follow-up, and I think it's a related issue. You also, one of your recommendations as part of this annual report is around the a forum to highlight the actions around the youth suicide strategy or prevention plan, I should say. And again, we've seen some really jarring numbers in terms of deaths of children and young people in care. A record number of those deaths are still pending in terms of the cause of those deaths, and so I don't want to presume what any of those may be, but we know that there's a lot that we don't know right now, but we have seen a lot of young people and children in care die. So I want to speak, I guess I'm questioning with respect to the youth suicide prevention plan and your recommendation to the Ministry of Health and Children's Services to conduct a forum on that. What has happened in that respect, from your perspective, about actually having that forum? What has the response been, and why is that still sort of an outstanding recommendation?
My understanding is that the response was a statement from the press secretary, who said that once the pandemic had passed, they would consider the forum moving forward.
Okay.
If I could just expand a bit on that, that is really the only response that I recall receiving. I mean, you need to know that when we're talking about wanting recommendations to be strengthened, it's circumstances like this that are really reflective of that request. It's, when I look back at the different reports that we've done in recent times, where we start with the into focus report, we move to an additional report on strengthening on calls to action regarding a critical time, which is really about supporting young people in transition. We move from there to the Into Focus report, which calls for a renewed effort with respect to opioid poisoning. We move from there to Strengthening Foundations, which looks at the assessment, information sharing, and collaboration for young people. We have pushed forward a significant number of reports that we think have good, solid recommendations for advancing how young people are served in this province. And what we would really like to see is a process where those groups that we make recommendations to come to a table to tell us what they're doing or not doing with respect to actioning those recommendations. I don't have any qualms if people disagree with our recommendations in terms of the way to get there. But they may say that that's a really good kind of goal to have, but we're going to do it this way instead of that way. That's just fine with me. But to not have either any response or to have responses that are repetitious in terms of sending us the same response time after time, or having responses like we'll have a forum when the pandemic is over, tells me that there needs to be a greater accountability for the actions of government in relation to them.
Thank you. We'll move on to Mr. Milliken.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Graff and Ms. Pelton, for the amazing work that you do. Obviously, having read the report, having read last year's report, having obviously listened to the presentation, complex issues are definitely what you're dealing with, and so I commend you for all the work that you do. I also want to say thank you to all the members so far who have asked questions. Some of you actually, both have actually, if anything, asked questions that I wanted to ask too, so I want to thank you for that as well. I guess what I'll do is I'm not sure if this is maybe just my confusion from reading the report verbatim, or I'm going to repeat it a bit verbatim here, but I want to build off a little bit what Member Pancholi has been asking questions with regards to the youth opioid strategy. And on page 58, you mentioned the year ahead, and you talk about place renewed attention on the opioid crisis. While it may have been compounded by the impacts of the pandemic, the drug epidemic is serious and threatens the health and lives of young people in our province. Through a special report, we will bring renewed attention to the opioid crisis and the critical need for meaningful action. You mentioned that there was the 2018 report and then the one from the middle of last year. Is this referring to a report that you intend to bring forward? And if so, when would we expect that? I know that this government has placed a significant amount of emphasis on ensuring that the opioid crisis that we are facing is dealt with in a compassionate and effective way. So I guess just looking on that.
And certainly I can clarify those comments. And you're referring to the annual report, correct? Yes. What we are referring to is the renewed focus report, which was released in June of 2021. And the annual report goes to the end of March of 2021. So when we were talking about anticipating another report, it would be this renewed focus report that we were referring to.
Thank you very much. I was just wondering if there was another one coming, but thank you for that. And no follow-up.
Thank you. Ms. Sweet, do you have a question?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Graff, for being here, and it's great to see you as well, Terry. I want to focus, if we could, a little bit on C92 and the work that's going to be done with First Nations communities as we transition under the new principles that have been introduced by the federal government. Recognizing, of course, that my background is working with First Nations communities with Children's Services, I know the complexity of how these changes and these principles are going to need to be implemented on a First Nations community base by base. I'm curious, from your perspective, the role that the Child and Youth Advocate is going to be able to play through the transition, and if there's going to be considerations that need to be made around how we support the Child and Youth Advocate and continuing to have a voice as we see the changes being implemented, or if you've had any conversations with partners around sort of the future of your role in this new world.
I can tell you that we reached out some time ago to Indigenous leaders across the province with a letter inviting that kind of a dialogue. And because of the pandemic, we've only had a limited opportunity to do that. But certainly there's significant interest on the part of Indigenous leaders in having that dialogue with us. How it changes our organization is something I think that has yet to be determined. The recognition that there will need to be significant changes in terms of how child welfare services are provided for Indigenous young people and their families, and who provides those services is a substantial question, and it's one that the Indigenous people need to be at the helm of working through. We have said we believe strongly in the inherent right of Indigenous people to raise their children, and that Indigenous people are in the best position to provide for the care, support, and services that they need. And we will want to do our very best to support Indigenous groups as they move forward with child intervention, because that's our best way of advocating for young people. The more that we can do to support Indigenous people to be able to provide their own child intervention services to their own children in an effective way, that includes the voices of young people being considered, that includes the rights under the UNCRC and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. The more that we can support that to happen, the more we're advocating for young people. And so that's our walking in kind of a perspective, and it's one that has so far been received well by those that we've conversed with, and we're hopeful that it will help us to evolve the way that we need to evolve to be supportive to young people in this process. Terry, did you have any further comment? Okay.
Yeah, for a follow-up, go ahead.
And I think so, and I appreciate that. And I mean, I am a strong believer that children being with their communities should be the ultimate goal of children's services. And obviously have a strong belief that the more Indigenous communities can take on the role and make sure that children are with their families is the priority that should be placed for sure. I'm curious if you're hearing anything from our Indigenous partners around the ability to implement the changes that are being negotiated with the federal government, if there is resistance around looking at the changes within children's services and how the direction from the federal government may be impacting the current services that are being provided within children's services, and a resistance around being a willingness to look at how these changes will be implemented.
I am certainly aware of challenges that are present for Indigenous people as they seek to move forward. Some of those challenges are about unknowns, where there really isn't the existing information to enable them to move forward in terms of their next steps, and recognizing that Indigenous groups are at different places in terms of those steps. I don't know whether I would call it resistance or not, but I do note that there is a need for the federal government, for Indigenous governments, and for provincial governments to all be at a table where there is a comprehensive kind of approach that's being applied. And I'm not sure if there is resistance to that or what, but I am aware that it's not happening at the levels that perhaps some Indigenous groups in particular would like.
Thank you. MLA Long, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Graff. I'll continue along a similar line of questioning, actually, because I'm sort of curious how this is going to work. I'm glad that there is attention finally to, and actually, you have me on the edge of my seat, actually, when you just flat out stated that the inherent right of Indigenous people with raising their own children. Parts of our history that we cannot erase around birth alerts, still linger in Indigenous communities, and we have to make strides to be better as I say, we can't erase the history, but we have to be better. So I'm glad that you have discussed this at length today. Reading the report and seeing the disproportionate number of Indigenous children and youth being represented in child welfare and youth justice systems, it's still cringeworthy. So I know that you've discussed how you've been consulting with and working with Indigenous leaders and communities. Just for curiosity, one question I have is, what proportion of the OCYA is actually, like the office itself is actually Indigenous? Obviously, Indigenous leadership in our offices is vital to make sure that representation is being done adequately. And then, actually, if we can just start there, and then I just have a follow-up question.
Sure. We don't keep track of the number of Indigenous people who are in our employ, but I can tell you that in each of our program areas, we have Indigenous people who are employees. They're certainly a minority in terms of the rest of the staff, but we have a diverse staff that includes Indigenous and people from other groups as well. And so, but I don't have a specific number for you. They are not the majority of our staff, even though as I noted earlier, the majority of young people that we provide services directly to are Indigenous. It does reflect in large part the overrepresentation of Indigenous people, Indigenous young people in the system.
Thank you for that. And as your time is limited, as you're not renewing your contract, I just have a question, curiosity of, with your expertise in your position, what it will look like. You know, I see the budget for the OCYA is about $14 million. So how do we plan a path forward to develop an Indigenous group that takes care of the Indigenous component in the child welfare system? Like, do you see it being an umbrella sort of system, or a different arm altogether that, say, I believe it's about 60% of children and youth, both in the welfare system and in the justice system, are Indigenous. So would that mean that there'd be a transferring of 60% of that budget to Indigenous community-led organizations on child welfare, or what do you envision for that?
Part of the federal legislation is the beginnings of a mapping out of how that should look, and at the end of the day, however it looks in terms of whatever structures are in place, be they parallel structures, etc. What is, I think, the hope of that legislation is that Indigenous people will have the capacity, the governance, the resources, the expertise, the depth of culture reflected in their communities and reflected in their schools and reflected in their, daycare programming, all of that, to give the full range of care to their children, so that those children grow up without the identity issues that children have currently when they're placed in care for most of their young lives and those kinds of things. And that structure can look a whole bunch of different ways, but at the end of it, in my view, success is really when young people feel like they know who they are, they know where they're from, and they're proud of their heritage, and they're able to negotiate life effectively. Can I go back to the overrepresentation question, because I think it's a critically important one, and it's one that, for me, matters over time. When I spoke earlier about the first Advocates report speaking to the overrepresentation, that was in 1989, 1990, during that fiscal year. And at that time, the percentage of young people who were involved with the child welfare services of the day was 32%. Currently, the percentage of young people who are involved with the child welfare services is 64%. At that time in 1989, the percentage of Indigenous young people who were in government care were 40%. Currently, they're 71%. When I say it's worse now than it was then, that's significantly what worse means. And I just think that we have got to find the ways to reverse that in a safe, healthy way with Indigenous people governing themselves.
Thank you, Ms. Pancholi.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Graff, I think you spoke very compellingly about, the lack sort of response or accountability once you've made recommendations to ministries, and how it sort of you get maybe repeated same key messages or maybe very little messaging whatsoever in terms of the response to the recommendation. So you also mentioned in your presentation how there was an intention, or it seemed from the work done by the Ministerial Panel on Child Intervention, as well as previous versions of this Legislative Offices Committee, that there be some accountability at this committee by ministries and how they're responding to your recommendations. And so I'm wondering if you could provide from your perspective, what would that look like? What would that accountability look? What would that process look like to fulfill that intention and the need for accountability for ministries as to how they're implementing recommendations?
Sure. I can tell you that when the legislation was amended to include this meeting as a follow-up from our regular standing committee meetings, we were a bit confused about what the purpose was, because from our perspective, we were reviewing our annual report at that standing committee meeting along with the other legislative offices. And so then to have a second review, we weren't quite sure what that meant. And that led us to think, well, what should it mean? And from my point of view, and I own this, is that I'm absolutely fine with a secondary review of our annual report and of the questions that come from that are we don't have the time or the time to address them in the earlier meeting, coming forward and being able to explain what we do, why we've done it, what it means, why it's important, all of those things. But also something that is really important to me is that those entities that we've made recommendations to, I think, should be able to come to this very same table and to say, and here's what we've done about the advocate's recommendations that were made in his annual report. Here's the actions we've taken. They may say we've taken different actions, but we've achieved the same outcomes. They may say we can't do this because. For me, it's less relevant that what they say as the fact that they're at a table to provide some level of accountability for the actions that they take or not take. And from my point of view, that's part of what could be on the agenda for this meeting that would make it more meaningful than just merely our reviewing our annual report with you folks again. It would be an addition to what we're doing now.
Thank you, Mr. Graff. And I note that this is the third time, right, that this committee has reviewed your annual report. Repeatedly, I think we have, at least from the opposition side, have asked for that accountability at the same committee table to bring forward, I note in your annual report this year, you have recommendations specifically for Children's Services, for Community and Social Services, Justice and Solicitor General, and Alberta Health, and to bring forward representatives to speak to how they implemented the recommendations outlined in your annual report. Are you suggesting, and would you support then the idea of that this committee at this time, and the Legislative Offices Committee, would also hear from those specific ministries at this table to answer questions about how they've implemented the recommendations you've made?
Yes. And in fact, that's in fact what one of the resolutions put forward by the Standing Committee following the review of our legislation suggested. It really does make sense in terms of how would there be a full circle in terms of the recommendations developed, made, completed, acted upon, and we know that it's been achieved. And really, that was one of the resolutions from the standing committee. When we referred to the 9 that were made, it was certainly one of them. I'm just looking for which one it was.
Thank you. We'll go to Mr. Milliken.
Sure. Just shifting gears a little bit. On page 55, states that as the OCYA shifted to virtual delivery during the COVID-19 pandemic, and I get that this question could also probably have been asked during the budgetary review aspect of it, but I think it still overlaps quite importantly here as well. Maintaining the quality of services remained a priority. The quality assurance team coordinates formal quality assurance activities. So given the challenges presented by restrictions imposed due to COVID, were you able to maintain what you would consider to be sufficient or adequate services, or structurally were there issues that maybe perhaps came about from COVID restrictions that made it insurmountable for certain services?
I could tell you that mostly we are very pleased with what we were able to provide for services. And I say mostly because there are some young people for whom face-to-face meetings is just absolutely essential to their sense of connection and our ability to move forward advocacy with them. And so in those kinds of individual circumstances, this may have been second best or third best because we were dealing mostly with virtual service. The other area is that many of those networking meetings that are part of our day-to-day work, where we would go out and meet with leadership groups and meet with boards and meet with other groups that are working with young people directly to have the activities that we're doing be elevated and educate them and also receive information about what they're doing. Lots of those kinds of meetings stopped or were reduced significantly. And in that regard, I think we have, we did pursue virtual means, and in some of those circumstances they worked, but they certainly weren't at the level that I would have liked. And the longer that time goes on that we are working virtually, the more impactful I think that is. Because there are changes in those organizations, just like there's changes in our organization, and those connections and that networking needs to be renewed and renewed and renewed. And so we are concerned about that. And the longer the pandemic goes, the more concerned we are.
Yeah, I would just comment too, if anything, I'd reinforce the fact that I think that your work, it really does revolve around face-to-face and creating those relationships. I know throughout your report you talked about relationships and you talked about how often that face-to-face can be the most effective way to intervene effectively. I guess what I would say then is, and I'm not sure exactly where it was in the report, but I also noted that I think you mentioned that there were also some spin-off sort of positive externalities that you found from this. I know that in one case you mentioned that sometimes it was maybe perhaps difficult to get into certain communities, even when face-to-face was available, but then through the virtual aspects, you were able to put more time into those. So maybe though marginally less beneficial, overall more beneficial just by total content. Are there advantages that you've seen that you're going to be able to leverage going forward in order to ensure that even though, of course, face-to-face, I think in most respects or in many respects, is best, that this kind of hybrid that you talk about with regards to going forward could be effective?
Yes, thank you very much for raising that. There have been significant advantages to some of the capacities we now have within a virtual environment. One is for example, when we have committees for our investigative reviews and we need to have access to experts, our ability to do that virtually just unleashes a whole different set of potential resources. And some of the challenges with that is that we can get people who have expertise in particular academic areas, for example. But often we'll be looking for an elder who can help us, and they may be available, but we have to take a laptop and go to where they are and link them in that way. And it still works really much better than us trying to make it so that everybody comes together at the same time in the same location. The other thing is that our ability to educate virtually has just really increased. We made reference to Advocacy 101 workshops having doubled in the number, and they've really doubled because of our ability to present information and to have interaction be virtual, so that people can participate from their living rooms and from where they live, as opposed to coming to a central location. So those are two really good examples. And we know as well that young people don't always need us to be in person. If there's a connection and a relationship already, they seem to be just fine with us saying, hey, can we do a virtual call to talk about this? And seeing the person on the other end of that line is really a valuable thing. And so there have been those advantages for sure. Terry, did you have any further comment about that?
Sure, I could just add a couple of things. And I think the most beneficial thing we've seen is how timely we can be. So an advocate can be in touch with a young person face to face within an hour of receiving an intake if it's urgent and if time allows. Still, as you said, face to face is ideal. So if we can get to a hybrid model where we can build the relationships face to face and have the follow-ups be virtual or by phone, or young people, now my age is showing, but like they love to text and all of the different platforms on social media. And so we've really learned to be adaptable and start where they're at. Where it's the most challenging, of course, though, is those young people who can't direct. So if we've got a 5-year-old who's in a challenging situation and can't really talk virtually without an adult in the room, it doesn't allow for the privacy or the relationships that we need. But I think that it certainly has been a learning, and we'll be able to take it forward and be able to even better advocate than we were before.
Mr. Chair, if I could just go back to that earlier question about this committee and its role in relation to recommendations. Could I just comment on that a bit further? Because I did have hope.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
The Standing Committee on Legislative Offices Review Resolution number 9 was the one that I was referring to. It says that practices be developed so that each time a report is under consideration of a committee of the Assembly, participation includes but is not limited to the Office of the Child and Youth Advocate and department officials, similar to proceedings of the Standing Committee on Public Accounts, and that all relevant departments provide documents in advance of each meeting. It is reflective of what we'd hoped this meeting could include.
Thank you for that clarification. Ms. Sweet, you're on the list next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to build a little bit on the comments that we're talking about in relation to the barriers of COVID and how that's been able to, or how that's impacted families and the rights of the child. I'm specifically looking at the rights of access for family visits, as well as the right around legal representation in counsel. And I'm just wondering if you have any comments or insight into whether or not the court delay process around
to do this?
Is all good?
Sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. Just if we could get some insight into whether or not there's been delays around permanency applications, children returning home, supervision orders, any of the information around that court process, as well as access to youth justice and ensuring that there isn't delays in children and youth going through their process, so that if there are any potential criminal court issues, those aren't being held out longer, or children aren't staying at EYOC or CYOC for longer than needed. Just some insight into sort of where we're at in the COVID world and how it's impacting the rights of the child to make sure that those issues are being dealt with appropriately.
Yeah, well, I can tell you that our office receives calls when there are those types of circumstances, and we have been busy with calls. And so that would that would suggest that we know that they're there, that where there are delays in terms of decisions that might be made about, visitation with family. There might be decisions that are made about court dates when the court dates then end up getting delayed because, courts not sitting because of the pandemic, those kinds of things. They're not an infrequent occurrence. They have significant impact on young people, and they or others who are involved with them will contact our office to see if we can advocate for either speedier resolution or something similar to that. I'm going to look to Terry to see if there's some specific circumstances that she could respond with and perhaps provide some greater clarity.
Sure. I'm not sure about specific examples, but we absolutely have seen young people concerned about not having visits with their family in the timelines that they have wanted. With the assistance of an advocate, though, Children's Services has been receptive for the most part, and I think young people are seeing their family, at least now. In relation to the youth justice and that court system, they're still doing virtual courtrooms. And so if it's not a trial, they are resolving a number of issues that way. If it requires a trial, then for sure there's a delay. What we have seen is the numbers of young people in both of the young offender centers in Calgary and Edmonton are less than in the time I've been around. They are quite low. And they have been receptive to having advocates continue to work with the young people in the centers. So yeah, there's barriers, but the virtual stuff is helping, and we've had receptivity when we've had an advocate involved.
The only other thing that I would add is that over time, there has been some progress in that regard. I think early days of the pandemic, most things just kind of stopped while adjustments were made, and there has been some improvement in those areas like Terry is describing over time.
Thank you. Follow-up?
Just a quick follow-up. Thank you for that information. And I appreciate the role that the advocate has. I used to call Terry a lot, actually. But my question is around ensuring that we know, and are we seeing and ensuring that the reunification that needs to be happening with children in care is not being delayed because of COVID? And if it is, are there strategies that you may have for recommendations that could be advocated for to ensure that that reunification is occurring and that permanency is being created in a timely manner and COVID is not hindering the ability for that to happen?
I think that's a wonderful question to have applied to the department who's responsible for those services, and you're in an opportune place to ask the question: should they be invited to the table? We see what we do, and when we are involved, we try to make it so that timeliness happens for young people. But we couldn't tell you about what overall that looks like in terms of the ministry's ongoing service.
We'll go on line now to Mr. Ceci for question.
Oh, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And like my colleagues in the room before, I'd like to say thank you, Mr. Graff, for all of your service and best wishes in whatever is next on your agenda. My question is a follow-up in a sense to the example you brought around the Public Accounts Committee and the accountabilities that ministries are required to show when there is a recommendation made. And certainly in my time as finance minister, I remember when the auditor made recommendations to ministries around their processes, there would be a pretty important focus on that from the ministries in terms of responding, and during annual reports they had to address how they dealt with the auditor's recommendations to their ministry. So I guess my question is, I'm thinking about finances and monies and how much attention is placed on that in terms of managing that. and dealing with the auditor's recommendations, and then regrettably, what I hear, the lack of follow through from ministries in terms of a public, transparent way of addressing recommendations made by you as an advocate. Would that be a fair assessment in your view, and perhaps how can we deal with that?
I think it would be more than a fair assessment, in my view. I can tell you that some time ago, the Auditor General and I both released reports at the same time. In fact, we used the same media conference process. He was reporting on specific areas of Indigenous services, and as was I. And one of the comments that he made afterwards, this was Marwan Sahir, made afterwards was, I'm not sure why you don't have any kind of accountability structure like we do at the Auditor General. You should. And in fact, when the legislative, the Standing Committee on Legislative Offices did their review, Marwan asked to go forward and make that recommendation. And then it was followed up with a second presentation by Doug Wiley from the Auditor General's office to say, we think that this is a viable and healthy approach to address recommendations that are made for children by the Office of the Child and Youth Advocate, and that's why we're here to suggest that the submissions sit with that bundle of oral submissions that were made, and so it really is, I think, an appropriate way to move forward, and one that would be healthy and effective for the young people of this province.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Does the Act need to change? Is that what you said earlier on, that the Act has to compel ministries to follow through with accountabilities at a certain time? Did I remember that correctly from what you said?
I'm not sure whether that requires a change in our legislation or where it would require a change, but obviously that action is not being taken, and it's not an expectation. And the only expectation that is reflected in our Act is that one response after 75 days, and that was a requirement that that ministries had always met. Whenever we made recommendations, they would respond right away. So that wasn't in addition to something else. That really is the only expectation that's been placed upon them.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I think there might be recommendations coming from my colleague to address this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ceci. Is there any other questions, Ms. Pancholi?
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just wondering, just for the, in your annual report, from 2020-21 on page 49, and I actually believe it's mentioned a few times in the annual report, you indicate that your office received 81 notifications of serious injury or death in that fiscal year. And of course that you completed a number of reviews. And I'm wondering if that is a 31%, I believe, increase from the year before. And I know, as the advocate is well aware, in the following fiscal year, we're not through that fiscal year yet, we've seen, again, an alarming number of increases in the deaths of children and youth receiving services. I'm wondering, Mr. Graff, if you could walk us through sort of and many Albertans might be aware of it or may not be aware of it, what the process is when you receive a notification of an injury, serious injury or death of a child, why that number might be different than what is reported from the Ministry of Children's Services in terms of deaths and serious injuries, because there is a bit of a different mandate or responsibility that your office has. If you could just sort of walk through the process and the numbers to help us understand perhaps what that process looks like, as well as why the numbers may differ.
Sure, I could tell you first why the numbers would likely differ. One is, and the main reason is that we receive information about young people who are receiving a designated service from child intervention, about young people who are identified as a child in need of intervention, those two different definitions that I speak of, but also of young people who die within 2 years of receiving those services. And those numbers are not kept by the Children's Services Ministry. We receive those through the vital statistics. And so that creates just a different complete number than what they would provide in terms of the numbers of deaths and serious injuries. With respect to the process and what action we take, is that what you'd also like to know about?
Well, sorry if I may, just sort of to clarify, do you receive the notification from the ministry, or you've just indicated, for example, that you get some information from vital statistics, right, as opposed to,
yes.
And so, what is the relationship, I guess, in that process between yourself and the ministry once a notification has been received?
I'm a bit hesitant because there are different points in time. One of the first things that happens is we receive an alert from them, which just provides us with information that says there has been an adverse event. It may be that a child passed away and and on this date, etc. But it really is just to give us an awareness that this has taken place. They follow that up with a report. And that report provides us with some additional information. We then are able to access our own information moving forward to identify some additional understanding of what's taken place, of what the circumstances might have been, etc. And we start on a process that has a decision-making tree, if you will, about which action we take by when. And that results in us either moving forward with a mandatory review because it meets that criteria of a death of a child, for example, who was in need of intervention at the time that they passed, or a systemic review if, for example, it was a young person who had just received assessment services and the identification of them being in need of intervention wasn't yet established, and that would take a different kind of pathway. And so it depends on those definitions as to how we move forward. But either way, the process then becomes ours to take action on in terms of contacting people or accessing file information or requesting information from particular bodies to enable us to do a full review. That review then goes through a process of being considered by experts, having a look at the research that's surrounding that addresses that issue, of drafting reports, of reviewing them, and eventually having a report that is part of a public release, either through mandatory reviews or through a systemic report.
Follow up, go ahead.
As a follow-up, so given in this fiscal year that the annual report was produced for, there was an increase of 31% in terms of the notifications. And then, given what we've seen in the year since that time, is there a point where there's communication directly between your office and the Office of the Minister of Children's Services, for example, where, obviously there's a formal process that happens where a notification happens and triggers the process you've described, but is there a point where there might be direct communication between your office and the Minister of Children's Services given the number of notifications?
There's not a formal process between them, but certainly we have the capacity to contact them and to say, look, we are concerned. We are concerned, for example, about the number of young people who are dying from opioid poisoning. We are concerned about the transition planning of young adults and and how that is affecting those tragedies that we're being notified of. And so we can certainly, and we do, communicate with the ministry on a fairly regular basis about that. Again, we operate with ministries at different levels. So for example, Terry would be meeting with their director on a regular basis. I meet with the deputy minister on a regular basis to have discussions about those kinds of topics. I've also met with the minister about those as well. And so it's not unusual for us to have those conversations, but there isn't a kind of a formal, here's how many circumstances have to be found until we do have the conversation. The other thing is that it may not always be us who initiates that. Certainly the ministry has really been quite receptive about approaching us to say, what are you seeing? And we'll want to have a conversation about that.
Thank you, Mr. Amory.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Graff, once again for listening to our questions and responding to those. I want to turn your attention to, once again, your annual report. On page 37 of that report, it discusses a concerning trend where children are caught in high conflict family disputes over custody and access. In particular, the report states that conflict is the single most detrimental factor to children whose parents have separated. And this makes it imperative for there to be timely, appropriate services to help families resolve conflict before they reach a crisis point. One of your recommendations, which continues on to page 38 of your annual report, states that you have called on the Ministry of Justice and Solicitor General to mobilize an ongoing information and education campaign to raise awareness of how children are impacted by high conflict custody and access disputes. Can you please provide this committee with a little more detail on this trend, what you're seeing currently, and in particular, whether or not you're seeing an increase in high conflict situations, and then what led to this particular recommendation, and what other recommendations your department has contemplated with respect to high conflict situations? Thank you.
The trends that we were seeing were reflected in the number of calls that we were receiving with concerns related to the well-being of children who were feeling caught in these kinds of circumstances. In 2019, 2020, those calls increased, I think, by 13%, and so we don't have greater information than that in terms of where the trends are related to this issue overall in our province. But the information that we did have was sufficient for us to say we need to do something. This group, the young people in our province who are impacted by custody disputes, is not part of our designated service group for whom we're involved with child intervention or youth justice services, and so they are outside of that purview where we would be able to use our authority to get to information so that we can look into those trends in a demanding kind of way. And so we wanted to be able to figure out how do we get that to the attention of government, that this is concerning, we've had these calls, etc. And a statement of concern seemed to be the best vehicle that we'd had to say, this is something where our legislation enables us to provide advice to government on matters of importance to young people, and we're going to exercise that capacity through a statement of concern with these requests to the Ministry of Justice and Solicitor General. Terry, did you want to provide any more information, or do you? I'm not sure there's much more that we have in relation to your question.
I think maybe just the last part, which was what action have we seen? I think I heard you ask that. And the ministry responded that they agreed with the intent of the recommendation, but we haven't seen a public awareness campaign. So we're looking forward to seeing what the agreement to the recommendation looks like.
Well, and in fact, we have a call into the minister to arrange a meeting. We've been trying to get a meeting with Minister Madhu for some time, and we anticipate meeting with him in the new year to talk about that very issue.
Just a quick follow-up?
Yes, I do.
Go ahead.
Thank you for that response. And I can appreciate that one of the recommendations was to implement an ongoing information and education campaign to raise awareness. Can you comment on any other recommendations that you might have made or have contemplated with respect to raising awareness about high conflict family disputes, and whether or not you've communicated that to the minister or anyone else?
I don't think I can provide any further comment than I already have.
Okay.
Okay, on that note, back to Ms. Pancholi.
Thank you. And hopefully we'll have the opportunity to perhaps have the ministry here at this table to potentially ask them those questions. That would be great for this committee, I think. I'm wondering if, in your presentation, I believe as Ms. Pelton mentioned, that the work of the Youth Council, which is really critically important, right? That, I mean, ultimately, this is about giving voice to young people. And I know it's been a year of transition for the Youth Council as well, many new members, and especially during a pandemic, I can appreciate that can be challenging. So, but I do commend those Youth Council members as well for committing their time and energies to giving voice to their experiences and those of the others they may know. I'm wondering, you mentioned about that the Youth Council had the opportunity to meet with the Minister of Children's Services to discuss the changes to the Supports and Financial Assistance Agreement program and lowering the age of eligibility. Not asking you to speak for the Youth Council or to disclose any of those conversations in details, but you know, from your work with the Youth Council, from that meeting, for example, can you highlight perhaps what some of the main concerns might have been? And what the response was like from the minister to those concerns?
Certainly, and it might be reasonable to start from a time before that, when the announcements were made that there was going to be a reduction of the age that support and financial assistance agreements were available to young people. And I was involved at a youth council meeting when that information came forward. And the reaction from our members was that they were very concerned. We had 3 members of our youth council within that group. One who is just at the point of contemplating needing a support and finance assistance agreement and was doing the planning for how that was going to move forward. We had a second who was in the middle of a support and finance assistance agreement and was very concerned about what would happen in her future. The third person we had was a mentor who had been through the child intervention system, had received support and finance assistance agreement, had pursued an advancing futures bursary, and in fact had come out with a degree and was mentoring our youth council. 3 different reactions, different points in time, but all concerned about the change to the support and finance agreements. So to move forward to the discussion that you're referring to with the minister, there was significant concerns expressed by the young people there. Questions about why that needed to happen, why it was young people that needed to do without when they had struggled so significantly with many of life's challenges, those kinds of things. There were certainly concerns expressed. There was also an appreciation for the minister being willing to listen to their concerns and to hear what they had to say. The collective sense at the end of it was that the young people seemed very pleased that they were able to have the opportunity to provide their views to a leader who is a decision maker about this, but also concerned that there didn't seem to be any adjustment to the decisions as a result.
A follow-up?
Yes, I do. And thank you, Mr. Graff. And as we know, ultimately, as decision maker, the minister did go forward with cutting those supports for young people transitioning out of care during a pandemic, contrary to what the minister had promised to young people on that program. So I guess my question related to that is, in your role as advocate and your office's work, did you find an increase, or maybe just what was the response from some of the young people who were on that program? Was that an issue that came up in terms of young people contacting your office, seeking supports or advice? Was that an issue that was raised, the changes to the Supports and Financial Assistance Agreement program?
Well, certainly we've heard repeatedly that was a concern for young people, and we heard it from when it was first announced, and we continue to hear it. The young people would like to receive additional support for additional periods of time. We know that from what we've been told that there are some challenges with transitioning to adult programs when they are moving from one set of structures, youth-oriented structures, to adult-oriented structures in terms of program supports. And so those areas are areas of concern that we hear about fairly frequently. I don't know, Terry, if you have anything to add to that, but it's something that is just an ongoing, it is an ongoing part of the struggle for young people as to how to find sufficient supports for the transitioning into adulthood. You know, the first report that we did as an independent office was related to youth leaving care. This isn't a new issue. What was encouraging was, in fact, that the age was extended for a period of time, and it's discouraging that it has not. And our report, a report that we did called A Critical Time, was really about recognizing that late adolescence or emerging adulthood is a distinct time of the development of young people as they transition, and that supports are needed for that population. And so we are also of the view of being disappointed that that's not continuing.
If I could just add, I think one of the things that we're seeing is there's been a commitment from the ministry that young people who are turning 22 will get the services they need to connect them to adult services. And for most of them, or for many, we're not hearing much. But what's been identified as adult services is PDD and AISH. And so where historically those would have been the young people who are falling through the cracks, young people who don't qualify for PDD or AISH are the ones who potentially aren't getting connected to the adult services that they may need. So I think that that's something that we have to keep on our radar and be very, very vigilant about. When young people call us, and if they're having trouble with their benefits being cut off, we're assigning an advocate who's helping navigate. And for the most part, I haven't heard of anybody recently who's been cut off and left out in the cold. So from my perspective, that's a good thing, but we can't not continue to pay attention to this.
Thank you for that. I don't have anybody else on the list for asking questions, so I'll just put it to the floor one more time if there's any questions. One more quick one coming in from Ms. Pancholi.
I have a long list. My apologies. It'll be one and a quick follow-up. Just, you mentioned during your presentation about recommendations closing if they're unmet after 4 years. And so I'm just wondering if you can, in the time period of this annual report, 2020 to 21, how many recommendations were closed?
I couldn't tell you. We could get the information, but I wouldn't have it in front of me.
Thank you. And then perhaps similarly with, I guess, with mandatory death reviews and recommendations, there's recommendations that come out of that process as well, and if there's any that were unmet, and how many during the 2020-21 fiscal year, and a follow-up in writing afterwards is completely fine.
Okay, then that's what we'll do then. We'll follow up and provide a response to the committee that can then be distributed.
Thank you, Mr. Graff, and once again, thank you for your service as advocate to the children of Alberta.
Thank you.
Thank you. Is there one last call? Is there any other questions? Not hearing anybody try to flag me down, which is Mr. Milliken, go ahead.
If there are no more further questions, I'd be willing to propose a motion to sort of round out the mandate.
Okay.
Is that?
Yes, I will put you on the list, but let me just get through one quick thing here. Given that there's no other questions, Mr. Graff, Ms. Pelton, thank you for joining us. And as this was likely your final presentation to the committee, I'd just like to take a moment on behalf of the committee and the people of Alberta to thank you for your work, Mr. Graff, and your dedication to giving the children and youth of this province a voice. So thank you very much, and best of luck to whatever you choose to do next. And if that's retirement, I'm jealous. And so enjoy whatever it is. And moving on to section 4C, having had the opportunity to review the Office of the Child and Youth Advocate Annual Report 2020-21, and having heard from the advocate, this committee must now decide what is next in terms of this review. Does anyone have any thoughts in this regard? Mr. Milliken, go ahead.
Yeah. I too would like to take an opportunity and thank you very much for your service and everything that you've done over, I believe it's the last 11 years, so thank you very much for that. With regards to the aspect of the agenda that we're on right now, I would propose potentially to move a motion from the floor with regards to setting out and concluding the mandate of this.
So there's two things we're going to have to go through. For motion to be brought forward, you can introduce the general topic of it. We do not need the wording. Then there will be a question to the committee as to whether or not they are going to hear the motion. Depending on the committee's choice at that point, if it is yes, then we will hear the motion. If not, then we will not.
Sure.
So you can give a brief outline. We don't need the wording, but just so the committee has an understanding. And then we will put the question to see if we're going to hear the motion.
Sure. Mandate, of course, with regards to this meeting was to review the annual report. So I guess what I would do is I would move a motion to conclude the review of said report. And then I don't want to go into all the wording or anything like that. That's the bulk of it, I guess. Probably authorize the chair to approve a report that might be produced by research services with regards to this committee's review. Beyond that, I think that would probably wrap up the mandate as per Government Motion 105.
Okay. So having heard the general outline of that, and just a reminder to the committee, this is because of Standing Order 52.041, which I had asked to be put in. So a substantive motion coming from the floor needs the approval of the committee. So in relation to the question as to whether or not we're going to hear the motion, we'll go to Ms. Pancholi to go ahead.
Thank you. I would imagine that if we approve and move to vote on this motion, that would again obviously then conclude the work of this committee with respect to the review of the annual report, whereas I feel that that's a bit premature. I believe we heard some very clear recommendations from the advocate around further work that this committee can do before the matter is referred back to the Assembly, and I'd like some consideration of that other work before we make a vote on this motion.
Thank you. Mr. Milliken?
Yeah, and thanks for bringing that up, too, by the way. I would also just draw attention to the committee that the final questions made by Member Pancholi were going to be provided, I believe, in writing as well. So I think there needs to be some sort of allowances with that. I think that can be taken into account with regards to the wording of the motion, which I would say would probably allow for approval of the draft report that would be produced by research services upon having had the opportunity for it to be reviewed by the committee. I think that would be in the wording, so it would allow for that potential look at the end of it once the draft is created.
Thank you. We'll go over to Ms. Sweet, but just a reminder, the initial question that we have to answer is, are we going to hear the motion? So before we get into the debate of the motion or the topic of it, we have to decide that first portion of it. So let's keep the comments to the initial question that the committee has to answer, which is, are we going to hear the motion? Ms. Sweet?
So if I could just get some clarity, actually, Mr. Chair, because I agree with you, debating an actual comment on a motion is not what we're actually discussing. We're discussing whether or not there's going to be unanimous consent for motions to be introduced on the floor.
A majority vote, not unanimous consent.
Sorry, the majority of the committee be allowed to introduce motions. So I guess my question is the motion that that you've proposed being that with the majority of the floor we can present motions, or is it specific to one motion that we haven't been able to discuss as of yet? Because if we're going to allow one, are we going to allow more than one?
That I don't know the answer to, but what I can say is that each motion or amendment, this doesn't include sub-amendments, each amendment would require first a vote from the floor as to whether or not it's going to be heard. And I just want to double check, Mr. Rempel, I've got that correct?
Yes,
Yes.
each motion is an individual decision.
Yes. So each motion is an individual decision.
But we haven't been introduced the motion yet, so how can we agree or disagree with whether?
So you're not agreeing with the motion. So all we're going to get initially is just the sort of the sense of what it's going to be about. So we're talking, are we going to hear the main motion? That's the initial question. So, or maybe I shouldn't say main motion. Are we going to hear the motion?
So
If
for-
the committee votes yes, then he'll read that into the record and we can start debating that. If no, then we move on.
So I guess to get more clarity for myself, could we not just have a motion that would say that we will now allow motions, more than just one motion, to be introduced onto the floor to be debated for the remaining period of the committee for today?
Hang on, sorry. I will turn to Ms. Rempel on that question. So, Dr. Maslin?
I think the developing practice here, since this Standing Order 52.041 is new for the 30th legislature, is for committees of the Assembly to vote on whether or not to accept a proposal of a motion, as is happening here, on a case-by-case basis.
And that's how I read it as well, Ms. Sweet. So we will decide each motion individually and then each amendment individually. And this does not include sub-amendments if we get to that. So the question right now, if there's any other comments to it, is are we going to hear the motion from Mr. Milliken? Is there any other questions or comments to that? Ms. Pancholi?
Can I just ask MLA Milliken to just clarify, I mean, I know we're not getting into the debate, but I'm unclear as to what the general content of his motion is. Is it to wrap up the work of this committee with respect to this annual report? I'm just a little unclear as to what the general motion might be.
Sure, yeah.
Mr. Milliken, if you want to, yeah, sure. If you want
Sure, I think I don't have benefit of the blues or anything like that, but I think verbatim I said something along the lines of motion to effectively wrap up the mandate pursuant, I guess, then to Government Motion 105. Now that we've gone through the review of the annual report, however, I think just maybe going beyond what I should be talking about with regards to the motion, I think I clarified also a little bit that within the wording of what I would propose anyways, there would be an opportunity that if there was a draft report potentially that would have been created by research services, that would be reviewed. So, but again, I think that under the standing orders, it's just simply, hey, are we going to hear a motion without content out or discussing or arguing about the motion or discussing the motion? And then if that is accepted by the majority of the committee, then we would hear a proposed motion that hasn't been agreed to yet in any way, shape, or form. And then that would be debated and then likely voted upon by the committee as a whole. Just the standing orders is what I'm trying to work with here.
Thank you, Mr. Milliken. Any other questions to this initial proposal? Not hearing any. So to the question of whether we're going to hear a substantive motion being brought from the floor, all those in favor in the room, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed in the room, please say no. Moving online. All those in favor online, please say aye.
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 All those opposed online, please say no. Hearing none, that motion is carried. I'll now go back to Mr. Milliken. Was somebody else? Probably just a delay in somebody's rural internet connection. Mr. Milliken, the motion is carried, so now you can bring forward your motion.
Sure. I would move that, so Milliken, MLA Milliken to move that the Standing Committee on Legislative Offices, A, conclude its review of the 2020-2021 annual report of the Office of the Child and Youth Advocate, B, direct research services to prepare a draft report on the committee's review of the 2020-2021 annual report of the Office of the Child and Youth Advocate, and C, authorize the chair to approve the report after making it available for committee members for review. I think that it's our goal here to ensure that the Office of the Child and Youth Advocate is not only doing its work, but it's able to do its work. And I think that through this review, we've seen that everybody here would agree that the work that you've done through your office has been, I think every single person here on the committee has congratulated you on the great work that you've done over the course of the last 11 years, as well as this year throughout the process of the review of this annual general report. So that's the motion that I would propose.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Milliken. But before we go to Ms. Sweet, I want you just to make sure that the wording on the screen is accurate, that they caught it.
I read it quick.
We can take a moment here just to make sure. It's just easier to get this out of the way now.
That sums it up.
Okay,
Yep.
thank you. Ms. Sweet, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate the government's wanting to conclude the report and the meeting as quickly as possible. However, I am going to recommend a amendment to this motion. Under Section 1, conclude its review of the Office of the 2021 Annual Report of the Office of the Child and Youth Advocate. What I would like to recommend is that the review be concluded of the office.
For any other reason.
I haven't even got that far.
Just hang on a second. If you're going to be referencing sort of the process here, Mr. Milliken?
Yeah.
Okay. So if you want to move an amendment, Ms. Sweet, you can just go over the same suggestion I gave to Mr. Milliken, just sort of the overall intent. I think you're doing that. You don't need the exact wording, and then the decision can be made as to whether or not the committee will accept an amendment from the floor. So we can go that route.
But the motion's already on the floor. Why do I need consent to amend it?
So for an amendment, it would need consent from the committee, a majority vote. Sub-amendments don't, based on the standing order.
This is such a process. Anyway, okay, well, I have an amendment I'd like to put on the floor. My rationale is we're not ready yet. And then I'll give you my wording and what it is I'd like to do.
Well, so we don't need the exact wording of the amendment. So we just need the general outline of what you're trying to, what the amendment would do. So we don't need the exact wording of the amendment. The committee then decides if they are going to allow an amendment to be brought forward. Then we get into the specific wording of what you want to have changed.
So very clearly through the last little bit of the meeting that we've had in listening to the advocate, clearly the advocate has made it clear that to appropriately be able to evaluate the report that is written by the Child and Youth Advocate, the ministries need to be able to explain how they are responding to the recommendations that have been made and how we can ensure that those recommendations are being acted upon. We've not heard that. There hasn't been dialogue around any information provided by any of the ministries that have been identified under the Child and Youth Advocate's reports and the historical reports. And I believe that it is not in good conscience of this committee for us to just say, we like the report that was provided by the Child and Youth Advocate, and therefore we're going to rubber stamp it and submit it to the legislature. We have a responsibility on behalf of these children that this advocate is responsible for, the rights of the child, which I have repeatedly spoken about today, to ensure that when issues are being identified, that they are being acted upon on behalf of the ministries. So I don't believe this committee is ready to say that this annual report and the questions that this committee has have been dealt with effectively today. So I have an amendment.
Okay, thank you, MLA Sweet. Any other questions or comments to the question of hearing an amendment from the floor? Okay, hearing and seeing none, then we will ask the question on whether or not we will hear the amendment. All those in favor of having an amendment brought forward from the floor in the room, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed in the room, please say no. Moving online, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, please say no.
No.
There's usually one that comes in a bit late, potentially.
Like a recorded vote, please, Mr. Chair.
Okay, so I believe that motion was defeated, but a recorded vote has been requested. So we will start in the room. I will just go member by member, and then you can state your vote, yes or no, and it will be recorded. So we will start on my right. Mr. Milliken.
No.
Mr. Long. No. Mr. Amory.
No.
Ms. Sweet.
Yes.
Ms. Pancholi.
Yes.
Now, moving online, I will give a longer pause to make sure that we can hear from everybody. Just given some of the difficulties potentially of internet connections, I will start with Mr. Cece.
Of course. Yes.
I'll take that one as a yes. Ms. Rosen.
No.
Mr. Shepherd.
Yes.
Ms. Allard.
No.
Mr. Van Dyken.
No.
There it is. Usually a bit slow. Okay, thank you, Mr. Van Dyken. And for the vote, I will turn to Ms. Rempel for the... Okay, so that motion is defeated 6-4. We are back onto the main motion. Is there any other questions or comments to it? Yes, Ms. Pancholi, go ahead.
Okay, where to begin here? So we just listened, I think we were all listening, to a presentation by the advocate, the Child and Youth Advocate, where he outlined multiple times the importance of getting some accountability and transparency from ministries who have received recommendations from his office, and that he had suggested that this committee would be the appropriate place for that to occur. In fact, he indicated that he gave some examples of where the response from government has been repeating certain key lines over and over again, and perhaps sometimes just a statement in the media about we'll deal with this later as a response to recommendations brought forward by the advocate that have direct implications for the most vulnerable children and youth in this province. We know that his office, as he's indicated throughout his past work and in the annual report that was under review by this committee today, that he's dealing with incredibly important issues such as opioid use, youth suicide prevention, youth transitioning out of care. It is very clear that we are in a crisis point in this province when it comes to looking at the deaths of children and youth in care. The overrepresentation of Indigenous children has not changed. In fact, it has gotten higher. And some responsibility is required by this government to account for what actions have been taken in response to these recommendations. Albertans deserve to know that. This committee is the appropriate place for that to take place. If we go forward with this motion as drafted, it means that we will not be hearing from the ministries who have been named in the annual report as having received recommendations from the advocate. The Ministry of Children's Services, the primary child-serving ministry in this province, directly responsible for the child intervention system, has a number of recommendations outlined in this report. We deserve, Albertans deserve, these children and families deserve to hear what work has been done and what work hasn't been done. As the advocate was very clear, there might be good reasons why the ministry has maybe decided not to take the specific recommendation or actions recommended from the advocate, may choose to go to a different path but achieve the same objective, because I think the objectives laid out in those recommendations are things that we should all be behind. But we need to hear from that. And if we conclude the work of this committee at this point, we will not have that accountability and transparency that I believe the advocate was very clear about wanting to see. And this is the committee where that's supposed to happen. It was laid out in the work done by the Ministerial Panel on Child Intervention that it was not just about the advocate's annual report being reviewed by this committee, but that there be some opportunity and accountability from the ministries who receive recommendations. As the official opposition caucus, we have put forward 3 times now, since this is the first 3 times that this annual report is reviewed by this committee, and asked for representatives from the ministries who receive recommendations from the advocate to come before this committee like public accounts, as the advocate suggested today, and answer questions. And I think that if we pass this motion today, as drafted, we are essentially saying once again that the ministries responsible for serving vulnerable children and youth in the child intervention system do not have to provide transparency and accountability. It's very clear. I think we simply have one, and we have the capacity. This committee does not have to deliver its report back to the Assembly until, I believe, end of February. There is time to still have those ministries come and speak to this committee. And I think if we pass this, we are ignoring the advocate's recommendations once again. And I don't think that that serves the children or youth in this province, and it is not what was intended. And I think it's very notable how many of the committee members can't even make eye contact during this conversation. This is the third time this government has tried to shut down accountability from its ministries for recommendations to assist children and youth in care. I don't know what they're trying to hide or why they do not support doing that, but this is an opportunity to come forward and be serious about taking some action. There's been no other actions taken so far. All we're asking is that we be able to ask questions from the ministries who receive recommendations from the advocate. And I think we would be doing an incredible disservice, not just to those children and families, but to Albertans if we are going to move forward with, once again, rubber stamping the annual report without putting forward, hearing from the ministries and putting forward serious recommendations.
Thank you, Ms. Pancholi. Mr. Milliken?
Thank you, and thank you, Member Pancholi, for your well thought out comments. There's lots that I would agree with in what you've said, and it's you said it very eloquently. That said, I would disagree that this is the forum to change the mandate of this committee. I think that the mandate has been specifically stated within Government Motion 105 that was imposed on this committee by the Assembly at large. So I think that it would be perhaps not the right venue in order to do what you're requesting. I would also just make a quick note that the office, OCYA, has within its recommendations talked about how there may be opportunities for forums, et cetera, where people could be engaged, stakeholders could be engaged. Specifically, that had to do with regards to suicide prevention, but perhaps maybe building off that, there could be an opportunity in the future for something like that in order to be able to take a look at those kinds of things that you've mentioned. But again, what I would say is, we're constricted by the mandate, and I don't think that this would be the forum to do that in. But again, like I say, a lot of what you said has merit. It's great, and I think that there are opportunities, even as provided in recommendations from the office, that there could potentially be a venue or a forum for some sort of an event such as that. Perhaps that could be the will of the Assembly, things of that nature. So, thank you.
Thank you, Mr.
Vote in favor of the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Milliken. Just before I go to Ms. Sweet, just a reminder for those online, you could raise your hand, but you can also send a message if you want to get on the list, just to help us keep track. Ms. Sweet. Ms. Pancholi, go ahead.
Thank you. I do want to point out for MLA Milliken that the Ministry of Children's Services did actually come forward 2 years ago and did present at this committee. The ministry officials did provide some information. So this is actually precisely the forum in which that should take place. In fact, as the advocate mentioned, this committee in 2017, the Legislative Offices Committee actually supported the idea that ministry officials should come forward to this committee to answer for their implementation of recommendations from the advocate. This is precisely the forum for it to take place, this committee. And further, I would add, and I appreciate that MLA Milliken brought up that there was a suggestion, a recommendation actually, from the advocate about having a forum on youth suicide. But the point is, that's a recommendation where no progress has been made. And that's exactly the point that we're trying to get at, which is that was a recommendation made to the Ministry of Health and Ministry of Children's Services, and there's been no action taken. That's what we would like to ask for those ministries to come forward to this committee and answer that and say maybe they have something planned, maybe they don't. But according to what they've said to the advocate, they just said it'll happen sometimes after the pandemic. So I appreciate your support for those forums. We support them as well. But what we'd like to hear is that is a recommendation that came from the advocate to the ministries, and it hasn't happened. So that is precisely why we need to have accountability for those ministries at this committee, which is precisely the forum in which that was intended.
Thank you, Ms. Pancholi. Back to Mr. Milliken.
Again, I just want to thank you for your comments. I'd reiterate that I think that the possibility of a forum where we could delve into some of those issues has even been presented pursuant to the recommendation. I think that the exact wording that was used would go along the lines of, engaging the relevant stakeholders to highlight the actions taken and results achieved. I'm hearing from you that you and of course the office as well may say that there's obviously opportunities for doing better or doing more, and I would probably agree with that statement. But again, I think that the mandate has been put to us to review it. We have done so. I think that if we all remember, just going back a little bit in the agenda, there was an opportunity for all members of this committee to ask further questions and make further comments. And I think that it was Member Pancholi who specifically stated that she had one last one and one quick follow-up. And we went through that. And for reviewing,
Mr. Milliken, over to the
again, for reviewing this document, which we have done. So again, I'm just looking at the government motion. That's all. So I think that within that, the motion works within that. And then of course there is opportunities for another venue as even recommended by the Office of the Child Youth Advocate. So with that, I would vote in favor of the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Milliken. Ms. Sweet?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to follow up on the government motion 105. I appreciate what the member opposite is saying in regards to, it was a referral that was sent to us from the legislature, which we are an extension of. I don't dispute that part of it. But I also sit on another committee, the Rural Property Rights Committee, which is fine, which also was referred and created through a government motion, of which we have just recently, right before we rose for the winter break, requested an extension of the work that we were doing at the will of the legislature and the government House Leader, to be able to extend the work that we were, to be able to draft a report, to have appropriate consultation and have the committee do the work that they needed to do. So although I appreciate what the member opposite is saying when it says that we were given a government motion and this is what happens, there is nothing that prevents a committee from going back to the Assembly and requesting an extension on the work that they are doing if they deem that the issue is important enough and relevant enough to do so. Now, in saying that, it does give us 90 days, and we haven't exactly hit that, and we don't go back to the chamber until February 22nd as the current calendar sits. So we have 4 weeks where there is a capacity to be able to virtually invite members of the ministries to present on the requests and the recommendations that have made by the Child and Youth Advocate that would still fit within the mandate of the government motion that was provided, that would still meet the requirements of the 90 days, and would still allow us to sit while the Assembly is adjourned or prorogued. Those are all that's 1, 2, and 3 of the government motion 105. So I respectfully disagree with the member opposite that we have to work within what he has interpreted as being the government motion, because the way that I read the government motion, it clearly speaks that that as long as this is happening during the period with the Assembly being adjourned or prorogued, in accordance with Section 21, subsection 4 of the Child and Youth Advocate Act, the committee shall report back to the Assembly within 90 days. So we have time. And I think that, again, as my colleague has mentioned, out of respect for the fact that there are some very serious issues that have occurred and that are occurring in relation to children in care, in relation to the opiate crisis in relation to the fact that we are in COVID and that has had serious impact on reunification of families, that has had serious impact on adoption applications, that has had serious impact on youth justice, that has had serious impact on day-to-day lives of children that are interfacing with children's services, that we have a responsibility to have more dialogue and conversations with the ministry that are working with those children. Now, this is not uncommon to happen. I don't understand what the resistance is. But I think using a government motion to say that this is the reason why it must be passed and stamped today isn't a good rationale, because we have time. We have another 4 weeks. And I'm more than happy to have more meetings and discuss this issue. And if people need to get substitutions because they have other plans, then they get substitutions. And we can continue to meet.
Thank you, Ms. Sweet. Mr. Milliken?
Thank you, Member Sweet. I'm listening to you, and what you're saying is good. I think there's a little bit of confusion. What you referred to with regards to real property, that Special Select Committee has to do with an extension. It doesn't have to do. It has to do with an extension in order to be able to meet the mandate. And so your logic for extension doesn't apply to expanding a mandate. It has to do with completing the mandate. And then again, I'm just looking at Government Motion 105.1, 2020-2021 annual report of the Office of the Child and Youth Advocate be referred to the Standing Committee on Legislative Offices for review, and that's us. It's not us with a bunch of stakeholders or anything along those lines. We're literally doing what the government motion has asked us to do, and then going back, we had the opportunity to review it and ask questions, and we did. We asked extensive questions. In fact, it was Member Pancholi, I believe, who mentioned that she had the final questions. And so with those final questions being done, I'm just at a loss as to the mandate is the mandate. That's all I'm saying. I'm not trying to expand it or anything like that. I'm just saying that that's what we're dealing with, courtesy of what has been given to us by the Assembly at large, by all 87 MLAs. And again, to reiterate, it sounds like there's opportunity for a forum in another venue in order to dive deeper into the issues that were so eloquently stated by Member Pancholi. So, again, just within the realm of the mandate that we have, I think the committee would be inclined to probably vote for this motion.
Thank you, Mr. Milliken. Ms. Pancholi, did you?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm really disappointed, I have to say, with Member Milliken's understanding, especially considering his role as Deputy Chair of Committees, that he doesn't understand that committees may request for other stakeholders, but in this case, it's ministries. And I have sat on a number of committees as well where we have the authority to call those. In fact, this very committee did that and called the Ministry of Children's Services to report on the 2018-2019 annual report of the Office of Child and Youth Advocate. It's absolutely within the mandate of this committee to do that. The member read out the first line of that Government Motion 105, and nothing in that says that all we are allowed to do is ask questions of the advocate and move on. Nothing in Motion 105 in any way limits the ability of the committee to bring in ministries. And in fact, as stated before, it has happened in this committee before, and it was part of the original mandate of this committee when reviewing the annual report of the Office of the Child and Youth Advocate. So apart from the semantics and the technicalities and all of that, at the end of the day, we are still talking about transparency and accountability for implementing the recommendations from the Office of the Child and Youth Advocate. There is no other committee that does that. There is no other committee that has the mandate to do that. This is the committee for that. And we heard very clearly from the advocate how important he felt it was to have some accountability for the implementation of those recommendations. He could not have been clearer, actually, about that. He gave a wholehearted yes when asked whether or not he believed those ministries should come towards this committee, and it is within our purview to do so, and nothing in Government Motion 105 limits it. To me, it speaks to this government's increased secrecy and lack of transparency. I don't know why they would put up these barriers, and quite frankly, they're not real barriers. They're throwing them up. They're artificial. We've already just shown why that's not factually accurate to say that this government does, or this committee doesn't have the mandate to do it. I don't know why the committee members would not want to hear from these ministries. Ask those questions of Ministry of Health and Ministry of Children's Services. Will they be holding a forum on youth suicide? Ask the Ministry of Children's Services whether or not they've improved their process for file transfers. Ask them if they're making progress on whole family residential treatment, as the advocate has recommended. I know the member Amory had some interest in the issue that the statement of concern addressed about high conflict issues, custody issues, and the impact that was having on youth. Let's have the Ministry of Justice and Solicitor General come forward and we can ask questions about what steps they're going to take. That is the role of this committee. It is clearly what the advocate is looking for. And I cannot hear any rationale from the government members as to why they wouldn't want to hear that. We have the time to do it, and I urge the members to vote against this motion at this time.
Thank you, Ms. Pancholi. Is there anybody else on the list online? No. Okay, I'll ask one more time to the committee members, either online or in the room, if there's any other questions or comments to the proposed motion. Giving that extra little delay for everybody online. I'm not hearing any. Mr. Ceci. Yeah, go ahead.
Great. I'll just briefly say that what I heard the advocate say is that there is a problem with follow through and accountabilities. And it may be that ministries are doing some of the work, or indeed all of the work, but it's not clear to me that there is a clear line of reporting back on decisions or recommendations that the advocate makes. I shared that in my time as finance minister. When ministries got recommendations from the auditor, they treated those very, very seriously, and there was a series of reporting back, not only in their ministry's annual financial report, but a report was done by the finance department that would tabulate all of the auditors' recommendations and report back on what was done by ministry. So there was two levels of report. They were substantive, and people didn't brush them off. Now, I don't know if that's happening with regard to the OCYA's recommendations, but I would like the opportunity to ask of the ministers or their staff what their response, what their actions, what they're doing with regard to the recommendations that they have received from the OCYA. And it's not like we're talking about insubstantial matters. We're talking about, in many cases, the health and welfare of young Albertans and their families. And if that's not important to tie the knot on, to go full circle in terms of understanding what outcome has been undertaken, I don't know what is, Mr. Chair. So I would urge members of the committee to spend the time to get the answers so that we can answer the question. Yes, the OCYA's recommendations have an effect, have agency, and people through ministries are listening to that and dealing with them. That's what I want. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ceci. I will just ask one more time if there's anybody in the room or online who has any additional comments or questions. Okay, hearing none, we will move to the question on the motion as proposed by Mr. Milliken. All those in favor in the room, please say aye. Aye. All those opposed in the room, please say no.
No.
Moving online, all those in favor of the motion online, please say aye.
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 And all those opposed
In favor.
There it is. All those opposed online, please say no.
Aye.
No.
No.
Okay, I believe that motion has carried. Thank you very much. Moving on now to other business in section 5 about officer contracts. Given some of the sensitivity around discussing officer contracts, I would suggest that the committee, along with, sorry,
Is there a recorded vote?
there could have been, Mr. Ceci, but we have moved on in the agenda.
Can you tell me what the vote was?
Well, it wasn't recorded. Oh, sorry, if you didn't hear, the motion had carried.
Okay.
So back into 5A, in discussion with the appropriate legislative office staff, consider moving in camera for our next agenda item, as we may touch on specific details around contracts of the officers of the legislature. So the possible motion would be that someone move that the Standing Committee on Legislative Offices, including Legislative Assembly office staff, move in camera. Is there somebody who would like to move that motion? Mr. Long. Mr. Long has moved that the Standing Committee on Legislative Offices, including Legislative Assembly office staff, move in camera. All those in favor in the room, please say aye. Anybody in the room opposed, please say no. And moving online, all those in favor, please say aye. And anyone opposed, please say no online. That motion has carried, so we'll now move in camera. Assembly to establish a select special committee to search for a candidate for the positions of Ombudsman and Public Interest Commissioner. Is there any discussion around that motion? Hearing none. All those in favor in the room, please say aye. Aye. Anyone in the room opposed, please say no. And moving online. All those in favor online, please say aye.
Aye.
And anyone online opposed, please say no. Okay, so that motion is carried. Thank you. Are there any other items for discussion and other business? Ms. Sweet?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wonder if I would be able to put something forward to the committee under motions and committee 52.04 when we're able to look at, oh no, sorry, that's wrong motion, or wrong part of the standing order. Basically looking at the fact that the policy committees have the ability to look at any other issue that may be relevant to the committee. So 52.03, committee may on its own initiative review any regulation amendment or regulation or prospective regulation within the mandate. So I'm just wondering if, given the fact that we've now written put a motion forward to say that we're going to support the OCYA's report, if we could put at the will of the committee that we also invite the ministries relevant as it does pertain to the work of the Legislative Assembly or the Legislative Offices Committee, to be able to discuss with them the recommendations that we have now approved and will be submitting to the Legislative Assembly for further follow-up on the recommendations that have been provided.
So you would like to move a motion that would then ask for further, like the same question that the committee just answered? Like, if you can help just make sure that I've heard that correctly.
So I would like to, under 52.03, as the Legislative Policy Committee may, on its own initiative, look into any issue that is relevant to the committee. Now that we've approved the report from the OCYA, saying with the following recommendations, and we are submitting it to the Legislative Assembly, or will be at the will of the committee, I would like to request that we further take our initiative and look at inviting the ministries relevant to that report for further discussion. The report is always available to the committee to be reviewed at any time. That is also part of the standing orders. Any report that is referred to the committee, we have the ability to review under our own initiative. So I'm asking that we further our initiative and use 52.03 to invite those ministries to present on what they're working on with the OCYA.
I'll just turn it over to Ms. Rempel to explain what you just passed on to me.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I stand to be corrected, of course. I believe the member is referring to Standing Order 52.07, sub 2. That reads that a legislative policy committee may, on its own initiative or at the request of a minister, inquire into any matter concerned with the structure, organization, operation, efficiency, or service delivery of any sector of public policy within its mandate. But I would also have to point out then that the Standing Committee on Legislative Offices is not one of the legislative policy committees.
Well, then why would we review the OCYA report?
Because that was referred to this committee by the Legislative Assembly specifically.
You can do it under your committee. Okay, that's fine.
And by legislation that requires it to be reviewed annually.
Sorry, Ms. Sweet, do you need any other? You're good? Okay. All right. Any other business to discuss? Ms. Pancholi?
I just wanted to indicate that the members of the opposition will be filing a minority report and allow for time, I guess, in the process for us to.
Are you looking for a date specifically that you might want to?
Yeah,
to
so
get that in by?
I don't know if we have a date. So, I mean, obviously, this report we have until end of February, right, for this report to go to back to the Assembly. Is that correct? Yeah, so.
15 days in the next 7 days.
Right. Sorry, are you looking for a specific, maybe you can help out on a specific date you would like to receive that by?
Yeah, just that would be helpful.
Yes, Ms. Pancholi, my understanding, and Jody can correct me if I'm wrong, but the deadline for reporting back is February 22nd. So technically, the committee has until then to report back.
Okay. So I don't know if we need to put forward a motion or anything to indicate that. I don't think we do to submit a minority report, but as long as it can be noted that perhaps the committee clerk can communicate with the committee members around timelines, and I'm sure we can work within those timelines.
Okay, Ms. Rempel?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Certainly happy to do that. We'll be reaching out to the whole committee as the report is prepared for review. Just a general note, usually about 1 week is allowed for the submission of minority reports.
Okay, thank you. Any other business? Ms. Pancholi?
Sorry, thank you. I just want to see if we can, under other business, and I'll defer to the committee clerk and parliamentary council as to whether or not this is within the mandate or whether or not we can do this, but I would like to put forward the possibility of a motion for this committee to conduct a review of the Child, Youth and Advocate Act. This is consistent with what we heard today, and it is something that this committee has done in the past, and so I'd like to put that forward.
Thank you, Ms. Pancholi. I will defer to Ms. Rempel here in a moment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just some general information, as I was fortunate enough to be working with this committee when it did the review of that legislation. Just for the general information of the committee members, that review of the act was required by that piece of legislation, and it was assigned to the Standing Committee on Legislative Offices by the Legislative Assembly.
Okay. So that review is already pending.
I'm just saying that
Okay.
the review that was done was specifically assigned to this committee
Okay.
by the Assembly, because it was required by legislation. It needed to be done as well.
Okay, Ms. Pancholi, you have a question on that?
Yes, I'm aware that when it reviewed it in 2017, it was pursuant to what was then at the time in the Child, Youth and Advocate Act. I'm simply asking, not because of it being required by legislation, but given the mandate, I suppose, of this committee, is it within the scope of this committee to conduct, again, a review of the Child, Youth and Advocate Act? The reason I ask, of course, is that I think not only did the advocate himself put that forward today, but also the important issue of Bill C-92 was raised and the implications that that will have in terms of the advocate's mandate. We don't... We certainly anticipate that certain Indigenous groups in Alberta will be taking control over their child and family services, and that may require a review of the authority and jurisdiction of the advocate, as well as there are other issues that he highlighted in his report that are outstanding. So that's what I'm putting forward on the table today.
Okay. So then it would still be, as we did earlier, a substantive motion from the floor, which would require a vote if we're going to hear the motion and the specific wording of it. And then we would have to work on the wording to make sure it lines up with what the committee is able to do and not able to do. In terms of requesting a recommendation to review legislation, or can it just review legislation on its own, we will get to that point if needed, but I think the general topic of what Ms. Pancholi is trying to achieve here has been brought forward. So if there's any other discussion to that, you can bring it up now, or we will begin with the question of whether the committee is going to hear the motion. So that is the first question that needs to be answered, similar to the process that we did earlier this afternoon. Any other questions or comments? Okay, hearing none. So to the question of whether we will hear a motion from Ms. Pancholi from the floor, all those in the room in favor, please say aye. Aye. All those in the room who are opposed, please say no. No. Moving online. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. And online, all those opposed, please say no.
No.
Thank you, Mr. Cece. Typically, there's one more vote that comes in a few seconds later, but not at this point. So I will do a recorded vote. We will go member by member, initially in the room, and then we will do that online. So to my right, Mr. Milliken.
No.
Mr. Long.
No.
Mr. Amory.
No.
Ms. Sweet.
Yes.
Ms. Pancholi.
Yes.
And now moving online, so everybody can get their mute buttons prepared. Mr. Cece.
Yes.
Ms. Rosen.
No.
Mr. Shepherd.
Yes.
Ms. Allard. And Mr. Van Dyken. It always takes the longest. Okay. What was the count?
So it remains defeated by a vote of 5 to 4.
Okay. So the motion is defeated 5 to 4. Any other business? Hearing none. Just a quick update for the committee members to advise that Jill Clayton has kindly... There it is. Thank you, Mr. Van Dyken. You can actually probably start voting now for adjournment. It'll come in just in time. Jill Clayton has kindly agreed to stay on as Information and Privacy Commissioner until a new commissioner is in place this summer. And agenda item 6, the date of the next meeting will be at the call of the chair. However, for committee members to be aware, of course, in December, the Government of Alberta announced that it's lifting salary restraint measures for non-union employees under the Public Service Act. This means that some of the staff working in the offices are now eligible for a one-time in-range salary increase retroactive to December 1st, 2021, and potentially to also receive an additional in-range salary adjustment on their employment anniversary date beginning in the 22-23 fiscal year. So this could mean that some of the officers need to update their budget requests. In addition, the committee will also need to meet again as early as next week to be briefed on how this change may impact the salaries of the officers and to provide direction on this matter for the upcoming fiscal year. Any other questions to that agenda point? Hearing none, we will move on to adjournment. Can I get a motion to adjourn? Mr. Milliken has moved that the committee adjourn. All those in favor in the room, please say aye. Anybody opposed in the room, please say no. And online, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
And anyone opposed, please say no. The motion is carried and this meeting is adjourned. Thank you.